chilling. Zack, thank you for being with us and getting that local perspective here in Suffolk, and see the Runnymede perspective more nationally in the terms that Alba's outlined. I just wondered if you could be in a position just to give us a view about Green Party's position on some of these policies relating to refugees and migrants, and maybe touch on a couple of questions that are in the chat about how do we counter this racialized anti-immigrant rhetoric in the run-up to this year's general election. But quite a few things I'm asking there, Zack. But over to you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me, Mark, and thanks for everyone being on the call. I'm going to speak for a little less time because I think Alba and Martin have covered the kind of broad spectrum of things really, really well, and I'm keen to get to more of a dialogue, but I will answer some of the questions you've just said. I first of all want to start by giving a huge shout out to Runnymede, actually. Racism is a massive issue in this country, and I think it's pervasive through every single aspect, whether you're talking about the climate, whether you're talking about our economy, or whether you're talking about health. And Runnymede have consistently built arguments through statistic, but also communities and anecdotal evidence, and they're constantly making these reports that certainly as an elected politician I find incredibly helpful. There's someone who's gone away and done the research, both qualitative and quantitative, and built that argument. Of course, the Green Party are there to continue that narrative and ultimately to win elected places of power to continue those. But it's incredibly appreciated the work Runnymede is doing on the ground to make that happen. So thank you, Alba, for everything that you and your colleagues do. And in fact, I did a Channel 4 broadcast last year around the pay inequality, and I was really pleased to have Dr. Shabnam, who came on and spoke about that. Thank you also to Martin for the work you're doing on the ground, and I will come to that more in a moment. I first of all want to start with something unusual, which is where I am. Because I've just had one of the most intense experiences I've ever had as an elected politician. So I'm in a very, very wealthy hotel in Mayfair, Hilton, which is not my usual modus operandi or somewhere where I'm used to speaking from. But the corporate jet investor conference invited me to come and speak. And I think they thought I was going to have a very sensible, moderate conversation about sustainable aviation fuel or kind of listen to the nonsense about greenwash. But I instead went to tell some of the most powerful and wealthy people in the world that private jets need to be banned. But not just that actually there's no climate justice without environmental, racial, social, and economic justice too. And some of I got booed and hissed, but I think it's important to speak truth to power, and I'm not bothered about being booed and hissed. Some people engaged with it in a really sensible way, but what was really interesting was some of the questions were about places in Africa that if very wealthy and rich people weren't traveling to them on their private jet, how would they possibly survive? How would their economy thrive? And admittedly, some of these people were from the deep south in America, so I'd say they're even further back, if possible, than some of the conversations we have in the UK. But it was just, if ever I had a concrete or tangible example of how racism is absolutely inherent in the conversations, this kind of white savior complex of we need to pollute the planet because we're somehow saving these poor Africans. It was pretty grim and needed challenging, and I was pleased to challenge it. But it's interesting coming from that conversation that you would not necessarily associate with refugees and migrants to this conversation. But of course, it is all the same conversation. It's the same conversation about how the richest 1% of world's humanity has burnt more carbon emissions than the bottom 2/3 of humanity. Yet if you looked at our press in terms of the Daily Mail and the rhetoric that's out there, this is all the problem of migrants and refugees. And someone put in the chat, comparing the Ukrainian refugees and how we treated refugees from Yemen, for instance, or from Syria. Now, I'm not here to say we shouldn't be treating Ukrainian refugees with absolute humanity, love, respect, and compassion. They've been through horrendous experiences. But frankly, when you look at refugees based on the different color of their skin, you can see the different treatment that this government and our elected representatives on the whole treated them with. Sorry, I just realized I'm low battery. I'm going to keep going, but if I disappear, I'll switch to my phone. So I think that's inherent, and that needs to be in the climate conversation. Now, this is all very negative. I don't think it needs to be negative. What I'm really proud of the Green Party for, whether it's on the local level or the national level, is we're telling those positive stories about migrants, whether it's asylum seekers, whether it's refugees, or frankly, whether it's economic migrants. We're talking about the benefit that people bring to our economy, and not just to our economy, but much more important humanitarian arguments. The fact that our society and our culture is built on migration. Now, with that, we need to talk about the trauma of colonialism and empire, but it doesn't all have to be negative. It can also be the amazing contribution that different diversity and perspectives has brought to the way that we have built our society and how that continue to be in the future. But ultimately, we can only be doing that by sharing stories of culture, by sharing stories of community cohesion, and creating a positive story for how our economy can be. And yes, there's the awful stories of, in a world of continued climate collapse, there will be more migration and there will be more refugees. And very often, the richest people have caused the climate migration from those communities that have done the least to cause the climate crisis and are the least resilient. We need to tell those stories, but yes, we should also tell the stories about why these people are welcome and actually they contribute and make a better society. Too often, the climate of austerity and 14 years of cuts, both from Conservative government, but also a Labour Party, who are frequently retelling that story of austerity and retelling that story of there's no money left, rather than blaming or making sure we have wealth redistribution and we tax the wealthiest, who are the real problem here. Then we could actually have that infrastructure, those housing, those dentist appointments, that transport, where when people say they're worried about it, those are genuinely held fears. I'm not here to say that we have got infrastructure, transport, housing right. We certainly haven't. It's problematic all the way, all the different angles that you look at it. But the problem is never the refugees or the migrants. The problem, again, is the lack of infrastructure, and they've been used to scapegoat, and we need to call that out. On top of that, there's some, and I would say, simple solutions. That doesn't mean they're easy, but it means they're not as complex as politicians would sometimes like to paint out. So we often hear about the backlog, and the fact we need to stop the boats. But we very rarely hear about the fact that they have blocked safe and legal routes. They have created backlogs on purpose so they could point to those backlogs and queues and say, look at, I won't repeat the language that some of our right wing or even, to be honest, centre right politicians or politicians in the Labour Party use, because I don't want to repeat that rhetoric. But whatever that rhetoric is, needs to be challenged with the fact that this has been political choices, a series of political choices that has created this toxic and hostile environment. And actually creating these safe and legal routes, processing people's asylum properly, making sure that people are dealt with compassion, that we have reunification of families, that people have the right to work when they arrive here. All of these are practical, tangible examples of dealing with some of the problems that politicians point to as if they're refugees' fault, as opposed to the problems of government choices. In terms of other practical examples, I'm elected in London and my job is to scrutinise the work of the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan. And there's lots of things I disagree with Sadiq on, and I will always point those out. But actually, he's been a pretty solid ally on a lot of issues around refugees, but there are places I'd like to see him move. So ESOL, English as a second language, is one of the most obvious examples. If refugees and migrants can't even speak the language and aren't given the tools or the learning and investment to be able to speak the language, how can they ever truly integrate into society? And a lot of the racism we hear is, again, about people being othered or feeling like people aren't inherent or aren't linked in with their community. Helping people learn the English language is one of the best ways we can integrate people into the community. Now, that's not saying for a second if people have got bad English or they can't speak English, they shouldn't be integrated anyway. But this is actually helping people along the line and giving people a step up to be able to make those differences. Having said, I'm not going to speak for long. I've spoken for ages, so I'm just going to wrap up very quickly for now. But I can't speak about these things without talking about the horrendous things we're going on and seeing in Gaza and in Palestine. Yes, Hamas should absolutely be condemned, and we need the release of hostages, but also the fact that we've seen our government and our Labour opposition complicit, essentially, in what has been an absolute massacre on the ground. And again, there's complicated conversations here about welcoming refugees. We absolutely should welcome refugees, but at the same time, we need to recognize that Palestine needs to be rebuilt as a state in itself. And so there's complicated conversations about how do you make sure you're not taking brain drain and you're not taking some of the best of other countries, but also our NHS has this huge gaps and huge vacancies that can be filled. But ultimately, we need to make sure we're getting the balance right between welcoming people, about rebuilding our economy and rebuilding our kind of society and system, but also making sure we're absolutely defending those countries. That ultimately, this conflict has come from a series of decades of awful foreign policy and, of course, the Balfour Declaration in the beginning. I've got other comments to make, but I will throw over to questions because I think it's probably going to be a more interesting dialogue. And thanks for having me.